Hi, everyone. We're going to give everyone just a second to log on to the webinar. So just hold tight 1 second. Hi, folks. We're giving everyone 1 minute to log on. So just hold tight for 1 more minute. Alrighty, well, let's get started. Folks can trickle in as we're going. I'm Shannon Von Felden, and I am the program director for the Rare Disease Legislative Advocates. Thank you so much for joining us for our monthly webinar in May. We've decided to focus today's webinar on an overview of drug pricing policy priorities and the current proposals in Congress. As we know, that's a very hot topic here in DC, and I'm sure a lot of interest to our advocates. Some quick reminders that for you all, you can submit questions through the Q&A box, and the staff person will either answer the question for you there or direct it to a speaker. And of course, the chat is always there for anyone who wants to chat with others during the webinar. And a reminder that if we do have any media present on the webinar, please refrain from quoting and treating it as off the record. And if you would like any quotes, please contact the speakers after the webinar. And as with all of our webinars and virtual events, closed captioning is available. And also Spanish translations. Caitlin just put the link to that in the chat. Today, we're really pleased to be joined by some very knowledgeable folks in this field. Sarah-Lloyd Ferguson is, I must have wrong name, Sarah. I do. Sarah-Lloyd Stevenson is joining us with Faegre Drinker Consulting, and she's going to highlight and give an overview of what those proposals in Congress look like, how they're similar and how they differ. And then we're joined by some patient organizations who will be giving their thoughts on drug pricing proposals and the priorities in drug pricing for the patient communities. So Deborah Dexter with the National Health Council, Mike Eging with the Rare Access Action Project, and Jamie Sullivan with the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you, Sarah-Lloyd. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shannon. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Also, I always love it when my headshot gets pulled up because you can see that I decided to have a pandemic hairdo change where I'm now trying to be blonde. So appreciate that. But thank you guys so much for having me today. I will try to be pretty quick here. I think I've got about 10 minutes. So please, Shannon, interrupt me if I do the typical Sarah-Lloyd and start going a little over time. But my goal here is just to set the stage, to talk a little bit about the political landscape on Capitol Hill, the 2 different pieces of legislation for drug pricing that have been proposed from each side of the aisle, a little bit of the history and what led into that, what to expect moving forward, and then a very brief overview of the differences between the bills, as Shannon noted. We'll get more into the actual specifics and how it impacts rare disease as some of the other panelists present. So if we can move along to the first couple of slides. You likely, if you've worked in health policy recently, you probably know who these 2 folks are. On your left, you have Chair Frank Pallone of the Energy and Commerce Committee, and on your right is Ranking Member McMorris Rodgers, the Republican from Washington. The reason I put them up here is just to highlight the leadership and the dedication to drug pricing on Capitol Hill right now. Very importantly, these are the 2 proposals we'll talk about. HR3 is the Democrat drug pricing legislation. HR19 is the Republican one. That being said, they're 2 very different bills. And they are also 2 partisan bills. So each of them only have support from one party or the other. Further, they're only advancing or at least being considered in the House of Representatives right now. I'll talk a little bit too before we go on to the next slide, as I mentioned, about how we got to this point. As you all know, drug pricing has been a major topic of political discussion for years. It has been a major talking point on the campaign trail for a very long time. It was something that Congress attempted to really get done in 2019, following the importance of this topic on the 2018 campaign trail. I mentioned that just because as you're seeing the politics evolve around this, we always need to keep in mind that there's an election around the corner, and drug pricing continues to be a very popular political point with constituencies. So you will continue to see members, especially in the House, where they're up every 2 years, try to push the progressive or conservative drug pricing proposals through each year. That being said, actually, let's go on to the next slide, please. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of, again, that landscape I was talking about. So one thing to note, each of these bills was actually originally introduced in 2019. This was, again, on the heels of the 2018 election, and also importantly on the heels of a failed drug pricing bipartisan compromise in the Senate Finance Committee. That was the PDRA, and I am forgetting the acronym. It will probably come to me at some point during this conversation, or maybe one of you remembers. But that was then Chairman Grassley and the Senate Finance Committee, and now Chairman, but then Ranking Member Wyden, offered a bipartisan proposal to try to rein in drug prices. For any number of reasons, that did not progress, and in response to that, Democrats in the House decided to introduce HR3 as a more progressive and comprehensive approach to tackle the issue. Then, in short order, in response to that, we saw House Republicans look at HR19, the Lower Cost, More Cures Act, as an attempt to provide a Republican alternative. Keep in mind that all of this was happening against the backdrop of the Trump administration, when you had a Republican presidency who was advocating for a lot of drug pricing policies that were not traditionally conservative policies. We heard President Trump talk a good bit about Medicare negotiation of drug prices. We heard as well the president, of course, had the most favored nation rule. A lot of issues that you would not typically put in that red GOP bucket were discussed and actually progressed during the Trump years. So a couple of things to note as far as things that have happened in recent months with HR3 and HR19 respectively. As I mentioned, of course, we all know this, and you would think, so just a quick reminder that, of course, we have a Democrat in the White House, we have a Democrat-controlled Senate, and we have a Democrat-controlled House. That may lead one to think that it would be very easy, or at least possible, for a major progressive drug pricing package to get through both chambers and to the president's desk. Of course, we also all know, never that simple, right? Just in recent weeks, as Speaker Pelosi and Chair Pallone have been looking to advance HR3, they've hit a few roadblocks. I wanted to note here, and I have on the slide, that there have been hearings, of course, Energy and Commerce, Education and Labor, which is another committee to which the bill is referred, and House Oversight Committee have all held hearings in recent weeks related to HR3 in some way or another. I mentioned oversight because they've been doing an investigation into prescription drug prices in the US since about 2019. So right again, when this renewed push for drug pricing was starting in the Senate and the House, the Oversight Committee started bringing pharma CEOs before their committee to testify about the prices. That is continuing to go on and is helping fuel the dialogue around this issue on Capitol Hill. The roadblock I mentioned is, as you see here, and apologies, I try not to read the slides. I'm looking at the camera so that I'm not just reading word for word to you. Is that just, just last week, Speaker Pelosi, as she has said she wants to move HR3 to the floor, received a letter from 10 moderate Democrats who have expressed concerns with the bill. This is important to note for a few reasons. First off, 8 of these members previously supported HR3 in the last Congress, so they've had a shift in their thinking in recent years. Further, it's very important to remember, even though Speaker Pelosi, the Democrat Party, technically has control of the House of Representatives, their majority is very, very slim. So even though in the House, she only needs to get a simple majority to get things through, there is still an opportunity, if she doesn't keep her whole caucus in line, that it won't even be able to get to the House. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about, even if it got through the House, what that would mean in the Senate. I will simply note that there's no expectation that Republicans in the House or Senate would support HR3. And most importantly, should it clear the House and get to the Senate, because of that lack of Republican support, it would require everyone's favorite new Senate gimmick, the budget reconciliation process, to get through the Senate. You all likely recall that this is a budget process that only requires a simple majority to progress policies in the Senate and was most recently used for the American Rescue Plan. Technically, the Senate has really 3 bites of the apple each year to use reconciliation, so they could use it for this. However, next up on the Democrat priority list is likely infrastructure. And we've heard from members like Joe Manchin that they want that infrastructure package to be targeted and not expanded to outside policies like drug pricing. Similarly, it likely would not pass what's called the Byrd Rule for germaneness, by the Senate parliamentarians. Okay, I'm starting already, Shannon, to go over time, but that's okay. If we can go on to the next slide, I'm going to do a quick overview of each of the bills. Again, forgive me for the simplicity of what I'm going to provide here. The HR3 really has 3 core components to think about when you're considering their main drug pricing policies. First and foremost, I mentioned it earlier that the Trump administration had signaled support of this. So this is something that had traditionally been a Democrat policy. When I was on the Hill working for a Republican office, we always said, no, you don't do this. Let the private sector negotiate prices. But now it's becoming a little more bipartisan. So this is one of the core pieces of HR3 is the ability for the HHS secretary to negotiate the prices of between 50 and 250 drugs in the Medicare program. Importantly, this could apply to commercial payers as well. And there are a few different levers on how this policy will work. One that is a concern to some is that this creates a price, a maximum for the price that's based off of an international price index, based off, I believe it's the average of 8 different countries. Some of the other panelists may speak a little bit more to that. There's also policy around inflation. I call it payback. I think the term they've used is rebate. But essentially, this concept is if a specific product has a price increase that is over the price of inflation, there's a requirement then for the drug company to lower the price or to pay back to the U.S. Treasury that price above inflation, expected inflation. Further, we're looking at the donut hole here, so eliminating the coverage gap and establishing a $2,000 out-of-pocket limit for Medicare beneficiaries. A few other points here, again, won't read it all to you, but there are several additional provisions in HR3 to attempt to reinvest some of the savings from this into federal research and development. You can see here the CBO cost estimates, as well as some of the folks who are opposing it for different reasons. But to keep things going along, let's talk very briefly on HR19 before I pass it off to someone else. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So it would take a long time, of course, really to go into detail with either of these bills. While HR3 has some core focuses, HR19 has a lot going on. I will note from the Republican side, if you were to read some of their materials, whether it be last Congress or this, you'll hear that HR19 has 40 bipartisan proposals that make it up, and this obviously the Democrats should support it. It is true that HR19 has several proposals that have either progressed previously on a bipartisan basis in the Senate or the House. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to progress. Again, this is really seen right now as a counter proposal to HR3, unlikely to move. Even HR3 is having its tough time, as we discussed a moment ago. That being said, here are the quick provisions within HR19. I won't go too much into this for the sake of time, but you can see, of course, that there are changes within Medicare Part B. There's a redesign for Part D. While the HR3 provided a $2,000 out-of-pocket maximum, this goes up to $3,100. Very, very politically popular here, this $50 post-deductible cap on insulin and insulin supplies, as insulin has been a main driver of the conversation around drug pricing. Expanding coverage for the outpatient drug definition in the Medicaid program. This is an important one, or one that could be of interest here. This provision would amend the Social Security Act to provide it's an option to states to determine that covered outpatient drug, which is codified in statute, may include any drug, biological product, or insulin as part of a bundle payment if it is provided on an outpatient basis. So a couple of different provisions there, again, to note on the Medicaid piece. And then, of course, something that we saw a lot in the Trump administration is the focus on transparency. So HR19 looks to expand some of those Trump policies, including reporting price increases to HHS, having them publish it on the HHS website, and then public disclosures, et cetera. Okay, I'm going to be quiet so that you can hear more from some other experts. If we want to go to the next slide, the final one I had here was just some quick links should you want to go to each party's section by section and one-pagers on the bills. Speaker Pelosi actually just updated this one a few days ago, so very timely. And then, of course, on the right, you have what the Energy and Commerce minority side has pulled together to explain their provisions. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to hear some of the commentary from the other folks as they're diving into the specifics here. So thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sarah-Lloyd. I think that was all really helpful. I actually learned a little bit as well, so I appreciate that. We do have one question about whether either of those proposals would expand coverage for compounding pharmacies. Is that anything that gets addressed in either of those bills?
That is a great question. Someone else may know that better, but while they're presenting, if someone else doesn't know it, I can figure out very quickly. So I'll do some searching unless someone else has an answer to respond immediately.
No one seems to be raising their hands. So thank you. Leanne, we'll get back to you on that question. Perfect. Well, I'm going to go ahead and move on to Jennifer Dexter with the National Health Council, a familiar face on our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and perfect. And go on to the next slide. Let's just also. There we go. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm glad to be here. Always one of our highlighted activities to participate in as National Health Council. For those of you that aren't familiar with who the National Health Council is, we are a national organization. We're 100 years old. We are made up of more than 140 national health-related organizations and businesses. Our core membership are the nation's leading patient organizations, everywhere from the largest to the smallest. Other members include some health-related associations and nonprofit organizations, as well as businesses representing biopharmaceuticals, device diagnostic, payer organizations. And we are always and will forever be led by these patient organizations that you see on this slide here. These are the voice that we carry forward. You can go on to the next slide. I think I might make an executive decision and just skip through these two slides because Sarah-Lloyd did such a good job of kind of setting up the overview. But what I want to talk to you a little bit about today is kind of from the patient community's point of view, what are the things that we are tracking here most closely that we think are the highest priority? Because one of the things that I found is in this debate, there are definitely things that affect an individual patient very closely. And there are also a lot of things that are important to the system or important to the relationship between, for instance, a provider and a manufacturer, those kinds of things. But from our constituency's point of view, the things that we are watching most closely are really what are the individual patient benefits, both directly in terms of out-of-pocket costs and better care. What are the advantages that they're going to gain through this legislation? And then indirectly, obviously, the health of the overall healthcare system, Medicare, Medicaid, are really critical to that individual patient as well. We are very focused on, and NHC has a lot of resources on how to do patient engagement right. How are we making sure that the patient's voice is included in decisions that are being made from design on to implementation? Particularly one of the things that in both the bills that Sarah-Lloyd walked us through, how do we make sure that the patient voice is front and center in value, in making sure that whatever we are doing to make sure that we're setting a value on a particular treatment or particular drug or particular device, that it is based on those things that are most important to the patient. And that is something where I think both bills still have a long way to go, I'll just say. And we are doing our best to provide, bring the community together, provide information to Congress and others to make sure that happens. As I said, neither of the bills kind of hits all of the dots. We are, as Sarah-Lloyd described, the situation is very fluid and the debate is very much ongoing. And we are working to pull together the patient community, particularly to develop some recommendations broadly around how do we contain healthcare costs. And there are some things within that that will obviously affect these drug pricing bills. So that is still to come, but we are working very closely. And we really think that much of the work that is coming will be within the Senate. The battle lines are kind of drawn on the House side, and nobody has kind of a clear whole way path forward. They're going to have to work to compromise, and Senate may be a place for that that drives. So some of the things I wanted to pull out from the specific bills to let you guys know. Oh, transparency. I didn't talk about transparency. I apologize. That within all of these legislations, making sure that transparency writ large doesn't just include like a whole ton of information that isn't actionable and usable by a patient or a provider. We want to make sure that we are being transparent about the right information in the right way and in understandable ways. So that's another goal that is out there for sure. So both bills include a out-of-pocket cap, as Sarah-Lloyd said, a $2,000 and $3,100 is the difference between the two bills. They also both include smoothing policies, which they take slightly different forms, but it's another provision that we hoped to advance in the final bill. And what that does is it allows an individual who is going to hit that out-of-pocket cap, that 2,000 or the 3,100, to have a mechanism to spread those payments out over the rest of the year, much like you would, buying something on layaway or in installments. But what this would do would be allow people who have high prescription costs to have a predictable monthly manageable payment instead of a one-time, as wonderful as a $2,000 or $3,100 cap is, it's still a lot of money, especially if you hit that in one trip to the pharmacy. So making sure that there's a mechanism where you can spread that out and perhaps have $250 a month instead of a one-time $2,000 payment would be a great benefit for many Medicare patients. So that is something we are putting forward consistently. And also I wanted to call out in HR19, I mentioned patient engagement. And one of the things we really want to make sure, FGI has a very vibrant and strong system of patient engagement. We may have our frustrations with it on specific things, but the system is there. CMS doesn't have the same system. It does not mean they're not doing patient engagement, but it's not as consistent and not as widespread. And HR19 does clarify that CMS should and can consult with patients and patient organizations to make coverage determinations. So we see that as a positive step. So these are some of the things we are tracking most closely. We are in the process of actually meeting with some of the House and Senate leadership over the next several weeks. So by the next call, by the next monthly check-in, there should be more information, but that's where we are now. I'm happy to take any questions, or if anybody wants to follow up, my contact information is on the screen.
Awesome. I was waiting to see if we had any questions. I don't see any. There's one question in the chat that you might be able to answer again in relation to Sarah-Lloyd's presentation.
It's going to be different it's going to be very different for each member that signed that letter. But the reality is the Democrats are now in the majority is a big part of that, which means it's not just not that the previous bill was just a message bill, but they see an opportunity to actually really get it done. Oh, I'm sorry. The question I'm answering is they were asking of the Democrats that signed the bill opposing or seeking moderation to HR3, who had voted for it previously, what had changed. And a lot of that is the broader politics of it and the likelihood of that bill actually becoming law. They want to have a deeper discussion about some of the specifics of it because they see that opportunity to do it, is my read on it. I mean, there will be multiple, depending on who you ask, of who signed that letter. That's the reality.
I just completely agree with that. It's a different landscape right now, where previously they would have been sending the bill, best case scenario, to President Trump's desk, where they knew it would be met with a veto. Now they actually have an opportunity to bring forward that change. And they're recognizing that if they were to work across the aisle, make it a little more bipartisan and moderate, which is what their position has been, is that it needs to be bipartisan, that it could get through the Senate potentially and make it to President Biden's desk. So it's just that shift from messaging and politics to really trying to get a win here, I think.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. Perfect. Well, I think we're making great time. So we're going to go ahead and have Mike Eging from the Rare Access Action Project.
Hi, and thank you for the opportunity to present some of our work that we've been doing on this issue. It's a really important issue, and as our previous panelists have said, this is something that's very fluid at this point. And so I wanted to take an opportunity, since we've kind of dived really deep into the legislation, to focus on some areas that RAP has been working on. As many of you know, RAP is a coalition of both life science organizations as well as patient groups. And we work focused on patient access issues, whether it's in Medicare, Medicaid, or working with the commercial plans. But any of these reimbursement and payment issues are areas that RAP focuses on. So that will be really the focus of my comments, is to look at some of the work that RAP has done looking at pricing reform. We can go to the next slide. And we can go to the next slide. We may end up actually skipping a couple of slides because it was so well covered. But we really look at this in terms of the balance and making sure that we have access for rare patients. And at the same time, we look at how that access is created or how the payment reforms are created to make sure that we also have a pathway for innovation. And then trying to provide that balance that can work for policymakers and help make for a more robust program that takes into account the diversity that is in both the patient populations in the rare community, but also among the life sciences organizations that we work with. And in a moment, you're going to see the study that we did. And I wanted to really stress that because in the rare disease life sciences community, excuse me, we have everywhere from family foundations, individual academics pursuing rare targets, to small innovative companies with no products on the market, to emerging companies with 1 or 2 products on the market, to global and multinational companies. And so it's a very diverse landscape, and any payment policy is going to affect each of these types of organizations differently. And we need to be attuned to that and be able to account for that in policymaking. We can go to the next slide. So we actually did an analysis in late 2019 and early 2020. And at the time we were looking at, the HR3 and the Senate Grassley bill, as well as HR19. And we did an analysis to look at how those changes in payment policy would affect rare disease products so that we could kind of have a directional gauge. And that's really what we were looking for, was a directional idea of how these various policies come together and could impact a product in the marketplace, because we felt that nobody was really looking at that and talking about it. And we've heard a lot over the past few weeks, even from policymakers in the House, particularly, really stressing a point that they felt that HR3 wouldn't impact the rare disease community. And so I just wanted to kind of tee that up, is that's exactly what we were looking at, to see if we had some sort of economic impact that may either be positive or negative from these pricing reforms. If we can go to the next slide. So we did an analysis, and as you could see on the previous slide, we selected a couple of very small rare disease Medicare Part D products. And then we benchmarked that. And again, it was just so that we could look at it against a type 2 diabetes insulin product, and wanted to see what the economic impact of the various proposals would do. And as you can see, clearly the Grassley bill is not the bill that we're going to be looking at in the Senate this year. So I would really like you to focus on HR19 and HR3. And we saw anywhere between 300% and 2,000% increase in costs to the manufacturer for those products. And that's an interesting, finding, is that those increased costs, particularly with smaller companies, may not have a place to go in terms of catching up those costs, recouping those costs, et cetera, particularly with some of the new rebate and inflationary rebate provisions in HR3, as well as the reference pricing, et cetera. That was so well reviewed previous to me. So we saw that there was a significant impact from both proposals on those rare disease products. Now, RAP is currently working to update our analysis, and we are working with our research organization to really be a more robust analysis this time. And we want to look at the impact on the rare community and the populations as well. So that analysis is currently underway, and we'll be able to update you as we proceed. If we could go to the next slide. So as many of you know, that RAP has been working in Medicare Part D since 2017. And we actually have been working both in the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Finance Committee on a proposal to cap out-of-pocket costs for rare disease patients. And we intended it to be a pilot project and had been in significant discussions before the advent of HR3 and HR19. We believe that, again, we need to be accounting for the diversity in the rare life sciences community and make sure that whatever we pass will not only provide the coverage, the access, and all the goals that the policymakers have in terms of transparency, accountability, et cetera, but also accounts for the diversity within the life sciences organizations themselves and the needs of the patient populations. If we could go to the next slide. And so we have been working and communicating on the Hill as well to make sure that this point is understood and that we really look at how we can achieve those goals and make sure that there continues to be incentives, continues to be the revenue that's needed to keep products and patient services, et cetera, available to patients, but also make sure there's accountability and access through the government programs. And so again, thank you for the time, and I'll conclude with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mike. That was really helpful. And then it doesn't look like anyone has questions, but if anyone does, feel free to reach out to me and I can get them over to Mike. And we can, there are a couple, there's a question in there, but I think maybe if Jamie doesn't cover this, this is something that we can ask after Jamie's presentation. So just hold tight on that question. So Jamie, go ahead, take it away.
Great, thanks Shannon, and thanks to the fellow panelists for great information setting up this last piece. I'm going to cover a little bit about what the EveryLife Foundation has been working on with our community Congress members in terms of how we want to approach the conversations around drug pricing. And the way we do that, you can go to the next slide, is really to work with our members to outline a series of goals or principles that we feel are important to the rare disease community and that should be really central to the discussion on any policy priorities. So we are not, what you're going to hear is not a position on either bill or on a specific policy proposal, but rather what are the things that policymakers should be considering and that you could look for in any given drug pricing policy proposal. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so before we dive in, I think some of the things that are important to keep in context as we dive into some of the specific proposals. You'll recall many of you have been on webinars about this already, but one of the things we point out in the beginning of our new drug pricing policy priority statement is that the National Economic Burden of Rare Disease study found that the economic burden of just a select 379 rare diseases exceeded $966 billion, nearly $1 trillion. And of that total economic burden, the largest costs were indirect costs from productivity losses at 437 billion, direct medical costs at 418 billion, and other non-medical and uncovered healthcare costs at 111 billion, which are absorbed directly by families living with rare diseases. And of that total economic burden, about 10% was accounted for by prescription medication and outpatient prescription medication administration. And the meaningful policy engagements as we move forward have to take this information into account. They need to focus on affordability and more than just one aspect of the healthcare system. Of course, as no one has to tell this group, it's important that policymakers understand that it is also 93 to 95% of the rare diseases, over 7,000 rare diseases still have no FDA approved treatment. So above all, we need to make sure that policies intended to lower drug costs don't inadvertently hurt the innovation and the ability to bring new treatments to market for these patients. So with that said, the principles outlined below have been developed with our Community Congress program with extensive feedback from members, patient organizations, and others to help define and refine these principles. And the first is really, again, focusing on incentivizing rare disease therapeutic development. That's core to our mission. And there's a tremendous amount of unmet need. So we need to ensure that policymakers recognize that therapies for rare diseases are developed for areas of unmet need, that there's unique complexities in that development, and that might mean that policy solutions that are developed to treat diseases that are more prevalent, or to policy solutions developed for lowering the cost of medications to treat diseases that are more prevalent or longstanding may not always be appropriate for rare diseases. That we need to ensure above all that we protect and preserve the existing incentives that are in place for rare disease drug development, and that we also seek new ways that we could incentivize the development and repurposing of treatments and cures for rare diseases. Also, something that has been in the news a lot lately, that we avoid policies, pricing and reimbursement policies that would actually disincentivize the use of the pathways that have been set up to make sure to bring forward medications that are treating areas of high unmet need faster. So expedited approval pathways. We want to make sure that the pricing and reimbursement policies that move forward don't threaten those pathways. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the policies are, preventing abuses, of course, of rare disease incentives that we want to, of course, all prevent. And moving forward, one slide. Sorry. Okay, and then this kind of goes into the next area where, we know that the FDA has a role, and that role should be upheld, and that role is to determine, the safety and efficacy of medications and devices and a number of other things, but we're not talking about those today. So, we want to ensure that any policy solutions recognize that role and uphold it, and ultimately don't provide opportunities that for payers to usurp that role in making these determinations for themselves. Next slide. So I think, it's important to think, to innovate here. Let's innovate. And we know that if it wasn't obvious, like in the comments before, we know that lowering the cost of treatments is important to patients, and that's an important goal of policy solutions. But let's think creatively, think innovatively about how we can both generate evidence that's going to support disruptive innovation. We call it in the models used to bring treatments to the market at lower costs while not harming that future medical innovation. Let's think creatively about new and alternative payment models that are emerging and how we can use those where they appropriate for rare disease therapeutics, including outcomes-based contracting, or you might have heard it called value-based contracting, where these are agreements between payers and pharmaceutical companies that are based on payment is based on achieving certain outcomes from those therapies. And that could be a real benefit to patients if it's done right and incorporates outcomes that are meaningful to patients. And then let's make sure that innovation in policy solutions does not occur on the most vulnerable among us before it's proven to be tested and ultimately not harmful to patient access. So we think there are unique considerations for rare disease therapies, and that ultimately a policy experiment or demonstration projects that are going to make wide scale mandatory changes should perhaps not be done first on a rare disease vulnerable population. Next slide. All right, so I realized as others were talking, I have a typo on this slide, but the quality adjusted life year, QALY here, is known by many of you, and ultimately goes without saying, it's a discriminatory measure that should not be used when determining cost effectiveness or other reimbursement and payment policies. This is something that's often used, you hear talk about as from value assessments that are being done, and those value assessments are being used by payers to determine coverage policies. This is not something that we feel is appropriate if those value assessments are using the QALY as the underlying metric, and that we should be doing more to advance policies recognizing the full value of a rare disease treatment by incorporating meaningful inputs from patients and making sure that the value frameworks are including the generally higher burden of disease on patients with rare diseases in their methodology, and including robust patient feedback, that these processes are not just asking for patient feedback, they're being driven by what patients want. And next slide. Lastly, decrease the patient access hurdles of time and cost. You've heard this echoed by other presenters. Ultimately, our focus is on making sure that patients are able to access medications after they are approved without further delay, and that they're not put through unnecessary utilization management barriers that can lead to delays or inability to access treatments at all, and that the coverage and reimbursement policies should ensure patients access to appropriate FDA-approved therapies in consult with expert healthcare providers, because that is the relationship that should matter and the decision-making that should matter most. We do feel that there's room for better transparency in the healthcare system and how pricing and access decisions are made, and that can empower better change and lower costs for patients. And then most importantly, at the end here, what we want to see is that policy solutions should lower the overall out-of-pocket costs for patients and families. And that is done through some of the things you've heard talk about already, capping Medicare Part D costs and smoothing out costs over the annual plan term for those with high deductible plans, especially. This is very burdensome. It's very hard to budget for a $10,000, $5,000 expense that occurs all in January. Our incomes generally don't go up rapidly, markedly in January. So it's a system that's set up to create hardships for those on high cost therapies, for sure. So that is where we end here. But again, these are ideas and principles that should be considered throughout any drug pricing policy solutions. And we hope that it'll help raise policymakers' understanding and awareness of what the differences are between rare disease therapeutic development and otherwise, and why we need to think a little differently about how we achieve the very important goal of lowering costs, but of developing therapeutic solutions for all of those that lack them now. That is it.
Thanks, Jamie. We do have one question that I'm sure all of you could answer it, and might want to give your view on it, but it takes a little bit of a crystal ball, I think. And so it's related to, you know, what is the most likely path forward for a drug pricing proposal, and the timing, and then if there is any possibility for Cures 2.0 to also be a component of these proposals. Anyone want to look into the crystal ball?
I know Sarah-Lloyd has a good crystal ball, so I'd defer to her first.
I say anyone who promises too much about their crystal ball in Washington is someone you should not trust much at all. I say that a lot, I know, we're talking about policies. That being said, this is a fantastic question. It is a difficult route, it's a difficult path to pave moving forward because of the partisan policies, right? So I mentioned a little bit of the reconciliation option being one. As I mentioned, they have 3 bites of the apple from the Democrat side. So they've done American Rescue Plan, they may do infrastructure. Of course, some of the drug policies were included with the American Families Plan that President Biden talked about during his joint address to Congress. I should have mentioned that at the onset. So that could be one option. On Cures 2.0, it's tricky, and that is something, it is so funny. I've asked staff in recent weeks, hey, what's going on with Cures 2.0? And they say, nobody knows. Downtown keeps saying it's happening. No one knows what's going to be in it. That being said, Upton and Zagat in the last few days have referenced that the new idea of ARPA-H could be a core focus of that, which of course would be NIH pieces. And it may be very difficult for them, so this is my crystal ball, but it may be difficult for them to identify specific drug pricing policies that are bipartisan that would fit into that framework given their focus. You never know though, because again, no one's seen it yet, no one really knows. And they have talked about looking at value-based care and some more point of care pieces in here. So those are my quick thoughts.
I would just echo,
it's a great question.
I would just echo what Sarah said. As we work with both Zagat and Upton's office, they have indicated that they do want to take on some of the access pieces, but those become the tricky challenges to really kind of make stick, particularly when you have these HR3 and these other bills kind of crowding the space. As we worked with both those offices, we submitted comments focused on 1, patient participation in Medicaid decision-making, making sure that patients were empaneled and empowered, and 2, on coverage and access to FDA-approved medicines closer to FDA approval versus in the rare disease space where it's sometimes 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, or in some recent rare launches, almost 3 years. And they've been willing to consider those, but I think Sarah really kind of teed it up that this is a really challenging space because I think most people believe that Cures 2.0 will somehow become attached to PDUFA. And again, that's a longer term view of things. So I'll leave it there if there's any other questions, but thanks, Sarah, for teeing that up too.
I totally agree with the crystal ball. It's kind of a running joke now when you meet with Hill offices. We asked the question about timing and what process this may move forward in. And we asked them to look into their crystal ball, and every single one of them answers back some version of it's cloudy. If I answered that, I have $1 million, all of those kind of those answers. It's this pantomime we go through in kind of every congressional meeting. But I think that the idea of at the end of 2019, there were a bunch of drug pricing proposals out, some of which are back now. The Cures 2.0 kind of concept paper was out. We were kind of setting the table for discussion around what might come next around drug pricing, what were going to be all the components that were going to be on the menu that people were negotiating from. And I think we're back to that point. And so that's kind of how I would view this. I think the letter from the 10 Democrats to Speaker Pelosi really put a little bit of pump the brakes a little bit, just gave us a little time to step back and kind of get organized to negotiate a little bit more. But in terms of timing, I can tell you now, I think most of the components are on the table for the negotiation, but I think we're far from knowing anything that would come out of it.
Great. All right. There is one other question in here about if there were any policy recommendations on drug pricing at the state level.
So I can start out, you know, we put forward more goals than specific policy recommendations, but within Community Congress, the Access Working Group has just started to break out into a series of subgroups, many of which are addressing issues that are directly actionable at the state level. And Mike also mentioned one about the Medicaid decision-making and making sure, and this is an issue where we'll collaborate with RAP on making sure that patients and rare disease experts are represented within those decision-making bodies, the panels that decide Medicaid coverage. So that is for sure one area that can be advocated for in the rare disease community. There are other aspects of coverage, and insurance companies are regulated at the state level, and there are things that can be done, of course, to help those in private commercial insurance plans or on marketplace plans, that can be done at the state level as well. So prior authorization, utilization, management, step therapy issues that all matter at the state level. And we will definitely be working through the Access Working Group on some of those issues.
And I would just add, as RAP is also a member of the Access Working Group, we are currently working in 6 states on some of the issues that Jamie outlined, particularly the patient participation, as well as coverage in Medicaid, and working with Medicaid programs to expedite access based on label and indication while they review the medicine. But there have also been some areas that we've been involved in, for example, in Colorado, where there was specific drug pricing legislation to set up a drug pricing board that would determine, the amounts, basically that a maximum amount that the companies can set, and a couple of other drug pricing bills in Washington state that would be based on ICER evaluations. And again, those are challenging areas because we want the information and we need the transparency, but at the same time, rare disease medicines don't sometimes fit neatly into the models of evaluation that some of the larger chronic care disease medicines and therapies would fit into. And so we need to make sure that whatever tools are put in place have the ability to look at the diversity of the rare disease community and patients, as well as the types of therapies, the investments, and what it takes to bring those to market. And so I do believe that there are solutions there, but those are some of the things that, we're working on at the state level, and we'll continue to press there as well.
And Shannon, if I can, I did see a question that had come in about where the savings, might go from some of the policy changes. And I think that's an important part to address too, because that's a big difference between what the proposal was last year and this year, is that there was no mention of how those savings would be spent or restricted to in this year's version of HR3. And that's definitely something that's been flagged among patient advocacy groups, because we do want to make sure that if there's going to be significant savings, that money is redirected to those areas important to patients directly, benefits and reducing costs to patients. So that is a major area of concern that I know many are following.
Absolutely. I think that's, it was very purposeful, because I think they don't know where they're going to need those savings yet, and something the patient community, Jamie, absolutely is pushing for. That is a consistent and strong message, both from the patient community and our partners. Interestingly, I've heard it a lot from industry too, that concept of, if we're gonna make these pretty significant changes to the system, to how we operate, we want to make sure that those savings are reinvested back into individuals, either for better care or individual cost savings, or increased access.
Well, I don't think that this is the last time we're going to talk about this in 2021 or 2022, probably. So I really appreciate Sarah-Lloyd, Jamie, Jennifer, and Mike joining us today. And please feel free to reach out to myself or any of our speakers if you have any questions. I think we covered the questions that were put in Q&A and chat, but I know that sometimes you can walk away and have more questions. I do have some quick reminders and updates for folks before we leave. We have 3 more minutes left, so I'm going to take advantage of it. Just a reminder that we are doing Rare Disease Week on Capitol Hill this July virtually, and registration is open until June 18th. So please register at rareadvocates.org/RDW. And you can register for all of those week's events, including meeting virtually with your senators and representatives through that registration page. And then new this year, because it's virtual, we have a really fun opportunity during Rare Disease Week. Advocates will have a chance to win up to $5,000 for their favorite rare disease organization during Rare Disease Week. You'll earn points for attending events and your Hill meetings and other activities during that week, and the top 50 point earners will win between $1,000 to $5,000, and the EveryLife Foundation will make a donation in your name to the organization of your choice. So we are planning to give $100,000 to organizations following Rare Disease Week, which is just a great way to give back to the community. And we're really excited about having this component to make it a little bit more fun to participate and also to support all the work that's happening in the rare disease community. This is just a reminder of all of our different events. For those of you who have attended Rare Disease Week, we'll have some of our great events that we normally have. We have some new events this year related to the YAR Leadership Academy. We'll be holding a graduation ceremony for those advocates. And then new also is the Diversity Roundtables on July 22nd. And just if you want to save the dates for all of our webinars and office hours, these are the dates. That you can also find them on the registration website as well. And another new thing we're going to do before Rare Disease Week on June 8th and June 9th, RDLA is hosting with state organization leaders and the RDLA advisory committee members some meet and greets. This will be a great opportunity for you to meet other advocates from your region and state and get together for some fun socialization over Zoom. And so if you're new and a new advocate, or maybe you're from a small state where you don't have a lot of connections with other rare disease patients or advocates, this is a great way to meet others. It'll be June 8th and June 9th, depending on which region you live in, and it'll be at 6 to 7 p.m. in your time zone. And the registration will open on May 25th, and that link will be put up on our Rare Disease Week webpage, that's rareadvocates.org/RDW. So you'll be able to find it there. And we'll send out an email next week about that as well. Adrian, you want to give your quick update?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Adrian Tejeda. The quick update is that the Diversity Inclusion Advocacy Fellowship is proud to announce the launch of the Rare Diversity Hub webpage. Is accessible through the RDLA webpage on the EveryLife Foundation website. It comes with new resources, a section for diverse patient stories, news and resources from various government agencies, as well as program descriptions and even translation, interpretation information. The webpage is constantly building, so if there's anything that we can add to it, please feel free to interact and let us know. The Diversity Hub is a collaborative effort, so we're really happy to have everyone see it.
Awesome, thank you. All right, and our next webinar will be in June, on June 17th. As always, if you would like to speak, or if you would like a particular topic to be presented on that you want to learn more about, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Caitlin. And a quick thank you to our partners, our RareHub partners, our presenters, organizations, and our industry supporters. These webinars are a resource for the community. We hope that they are helpful, and we really appreciate all of the organizations that partner with us to make them happen. So that's it for today. As always, the recording of this webinar will be posted on our website either this afternoon or tomorrow at rareadvocates.org/webinars. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. And Caitlin and I you want to hold it open just for a minute in case anyone comes through with questions in the chat or Q&A. Thanks, Adrian. Caitlin, you could probably stop recording.
Perfect.